the violence around the election in Afghanistan is having some resonance in neighbouring Pakistan. And I've been talking to Rani Singh of the BBC in Islamabad, and I asked Rani if the violence, if it's pretty clear that the violence and the election are linked.
Yes, sadly so, Rod. Coming up to the election, it's this huge cycle of violence, the wedding today, and something in the green zone as well. But as you know, Afghanistan is now the deadliest conflict in the world, beating off Syria, Libya, Yemen. I'm afraid I wouldn't rate the chances of short-term peace there at all.
Yeah. Obviously, this follows the failure of the peace talks, or the apparent failure of the peace talks. And the Taliban are just really sandbagging the election, aren't they?
Pretty much. I mean, the US, as you know, had been talking to the Taliban, Rod, and it had been hoped that there might be an agreement that would lead to some US troops pulling out of Afghanistan. Now, the dialogue has stalled, but some analysts think it may be just a pause. And as you say, meantime, the Taliban are talking to regional players, and a Taliban delegation has been in Beijing to discuss the impasse. Now,
have the Taliban been in Islamabad? Are they talking to the Pakistani government?
Not to my knowledge at the moment, but who knows what's going on behind the scenes. Now, I spoke to Hila Najibullah, who's written a book on reconciliation and social healing in Afghanistan. She's worked for the International Red Cross, Rod, and she's worked on migration across Asia and Europe. Hila is the daughter of the late Afghan President Najibullah, who was killed in his country in 1996. Here's what Hila had to say to us about the frozen peace talks.
Well, it's not peace talks. It's a withdrawal agreement between the United States and the Taliban. Nobody's really talking about a regional security agreement that was signed between the US and Afghanistan. It's a process that was decided amongst two stakeholders, basically, without consulting the Afghan people, or for that matter, the Afghan government.
As you know, Afghanistan shares a land border with its neighbour Pakistan, and over time, Pakistan's mainly military leaders have involved Pakistan in what's been going on in Afghanistan. And Hila, like many Afghans, is critical of this.
I think it's important that the Pakistan government acknowledges its destructive role throughout the Cold War up until the war on terror and takes responsibility for it rather than play the victim role, and then be able to stop hosting and fostering terrorism within its borders against its strategic depth.
Rod, Hila's comment that Pakistan needs to do some soul-searching about its role in Afghanistan's conflict history resonates with some people in Pakistan. As I said, Pakistan has also been under military rule much of the time. Now, as you know, Afghan elements that collaborated with Pakistan did so by choice. And interestingly, the week before last, on the 12th of September, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan said this to Russia Today.
By participating in the war, and I repeat, I was against it. Here in the 80s, we were training these mujahideen, people to do jihad. So these people were trained by Pakistan, funded by the American CIA. A decade later, when the Americans come into Afghanistan, the same groups who are all in Pakistan are supposed to say that no, now because the Americans are there, it's no longer jihad, it's terrorism. You know, it was a big contradiction, and I strongly felt that Pakistan should have been neutral.
Can that materially change the situation now? If the current Pakistani president believes that all that time ago Pakistan should have been a neutral observer and not an actual player?
Well, it is an indication, because it was only the week before last, it is an indication of his thinking, because a military leader wouldn't say that, for instance. So it would be interesting to see how this plays out and what happens. Of course, the US forces were in Afghanistan for nearly 18 years, and there was still conflict. So even a continued presence would not be any kind of guarantee of peace. And it's hard to see how there can be a peaceful democratic outcome in Afghanistan without the Afghans sitting down and talking to each other. But there are so many different factions there, it's hard to see that happening.
Well, let's talk about the Asian equivalent of U2. That's a
Yes.
big claim, isn't it, really?
Actually, it was the New York Times that called Junoon the U2 of South Asia. You know, this group is big. It sold over 25 million albums around the world, and it was the first rock band to have performed at the UN General Assembly. They've been going since 1990. They took a pause for 14 years, and now they're on a big reunion world tour due to public demand. They play what they call Sufi rock. See if you can spot a shade of Led Zeppelin in this little extract.
So we can hear the bass line, the driving bass line in there, and they're pretty open, are they, about their debt, if you like, to Led Zeppelin way back when?
Yeah, the lead singer, founder, songwriter, and lead guitarist Salman Ahmad writes vividly often about how he was very heavily influenced by Led Zeppelin and others in his youth. And I interviewed him ages ago for the BBC World Service, and I spoke to him just now while he's touring America. Now, I better add, Rod, that this interview is set against India's strict military clampdown recently on the part of Kashmir it administers and the removal of Kashmir's autonomy. And, you know, Junoon played there many years ago, and Salman Ahmad has just co-written an op-ed about Kashmir. So I started off by asking him about it.
Since August 5th, I've been getting so many messages from Kashmiris who are Junoon fans. I asked my friend Dr. Rajmohan Gandhi, who's Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, as people who belong to the region from India and Pakistan, can we put out a plea for conflict resolution? We want that the voice of the voiceless Kashmiri people reaches the world. With the United Nations General Assembly session, we feel that an op-ed is a way to further the dialogue, the conversation on Kashmir.
After decades of conflict, how do you see peace coming to Kashmir?
Peace will not come if you silence, torture, imprison people. Peace will come through democratic means, through dialogue. And we urge the leaders of Pakistan, India, the United States, and others to look at this 70-year-old conflict and find a solution for it. Just the way that conflict resolution was achieved in East Timor, South Africa, Northern Ireland, that's what we hope will be the way forward for Kashmir.
Junoon's the only Pakistani band to perform at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Where does your desire for conflict resolution come from?
So Rani, I think my passion for conflict resolution comes from growing up in Pakistan. When I was a child, I always wanted my parents to get along. I was always the bridge builder between them and in my family as well. The words and lyrics and music of Junoon, it's a message of love. It's a message of social justice. Peace. There's a song, Ghumtana, which encapsulates that feeling of working together, having hope, and believing in change.
You've written in your book, Rock and Roll Jihad, how you wanted to become a musician, but your parents got you to qualify as a doctor as well. How do these two sides of you coexist?
Well, both the music and the medicine complement each other, because in medicine, I've spoken about HIV and AIDS and polio eradication in Pakistan. It's a way of reaching out to people using the same tools that I have as an artist as well.
And one can't expect people from Pakistan to be restrained about their views on what's happening in Kashmir at the moment. There must be very strong feelings.
There are very strong feelings about what's going on in Kashmir, but this isn't a one-off. I mean, Salman Ahmad is a peace activist, and he expresses it through his music and through the pores in his skin, it feels as though. After Salman left the studio, I found out that he was going to a one-on-one meeting with the US State Department to discuss Kashmir this week. So I asked him to confirm this for me, and here's what he said.
As a UN Goodwill Ambassador, I interface with the State Department. Regarding my work on Kashmir and the op-ed that I wrote with Dr. Gandhi, I shared that with the State Department because the State Department is also listening to all voices on the Kashmir issue. I was invited on a one-to-one meeting. In fact, on the 25th of September in New York City, I'm meeting with the State Department. I can't name them right now for obvious reasons. This has specifically to do with religious freedom, religious intolerance. That's all I can tell you.
So we've heard on Monday from Greta Thunberg, and of course it comes against the background of the climate strike at the end of last week. How did that go in Pakistan? Did school children in Pakistan take part?
You know, school children are quite sort of rigidly kept in school, but there were huge protests around Pakistan, and they're going on this week. And in fact, it became one of the biggest non-political, non-religious movements the country's ever seen. And the government seems to be listening. You know, Rod, Pakistan contributes less than 1% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But what goes on in the rest of the world really does affect Pakistan. And I talked to Anam Zeb, a 30-year-old climate activist.
Pakistan is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So you have a long coastline, which is already experiencing sea level rise, sea intrusion, land erosion. You go a little bit higher, you come to the desert areas, which are becoming increasingly desertified. At the same time, you have prolonged droughts. You go up slightly higher to the fertile plains, where we're being hit almost every year by extreme weather events, as well as changes in precipitation, changes in temperature patterns that are causing crops to fail.
You know, 16,000 people came to this march, double what was expected. And to cover off the fact that that activists can't be joined by school children, they have been going into schools. So I asked Anam who has been taking part in the strike.
While Islamabad, Lahore and Karachi have received a lot of media attention, we feel that the climate strikes that have taken place in the smaller cities, while smaller in number, it is the actual people who are at the forefront of climate change who have been coming out of their houses to march. So in Thatta, you have the fishermen who have been coming out to march. In Punjab, you've had the farmers coming out to march. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you have students coming out to march. And these are the people who are at the forefront, and therefore, even though their strikes were smaller than those in the major cities, they were the most impactful.
Anam said that climate change affects everywhere in Pakistan, so I spoke to 33-year-old Karamat Ali, who lives up in the glacier region, and he talks about the effect on cattle and agriculture there. You know, in the past, melting glaciers destroyed half the valley. 200 homes were washed away. And he recorded for us the sound of an actual avalanche in the mountains near his village in an area called Hunza.
These heavy glaciers are moving rapidly, and it has destroyed many houses, cattle, and they have destroyed their crops. So in the last month, in one of our village in Hunza, Pasu Valley, people have started destroying their own houses so they can have some of their belongings. Otherwise, water will take all away.
The actual impact of climate change. Rani Singh reporting there for us.